This is A Word, a podcast from Slate. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. Donald Glover, LeVar Burton, Cree Summer. These people aren't just talented artists. They're part of the vanguard of Black nerd culture that's gone from the fringes to the mainstream in entertainment. But with the racist backlash against Black characters and everything from House of the Dragon to Interview with the Vampire to Doctor Who, where is there a safe space for Black sci-fi and genre geeks to hang out?
That's what Con's about. It's about positive fandoms. Like, you come to something because you liked something.
Geeking out at BlerdCon, coming up on A Word with me, Jason Johnson. Stay with us. Welcome to A Word, a podcast about race and politics and everything else. I'm your host, Jason Johnson. It's convention season and nerds everywhere may be suiting up to attend the cons, gatherings of hardcore science fiction, comic book, fantasy, or anime fandoms. And so A Word is going on the road to BlerdCon in Crystal City in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., the gathering created for and by African-American fans. Of course, everyone is invited, but as the con enters its 8th year and the crowds of cosplayers, video game enthusiasts, and nerds of all kinds have swelled to over 10,000 attendees, the energy is definitely focused on Black joy. On today's show, we have two special guests who will be featured at BlerdCon here to talk about Black nerddom and their careers and experiences. The first is Jay Washington. He's a former professional wrestler turned stand-up comedian, has been on everything from Netflix's A Joke to HBO's Rap Shit to comedy clubs around the country. Also with us is Phil Lamarr. He's an actor and award-winning voice artist who's voiced everyone from Cartoon Network's Samurai Jack, Futurama's Hermes, Green Lantern, and literally dozens of other roles. Gentlemen, I'm super excited to have you here. Welcome to A Word.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me, man. I'm happy to be here. You just like people can't see you, but the smile and the joy on your face, just reading everything was just priceless for me.
I'm pretty sure that, with your big, deep voice, people listening to this are going to keep thinking, that's Jon Stewart talking. No, that's Jason.
Right. It's the guy who doesn't have the rig. I'll start with this because there's a lot of people in the audience who, they get my comic book references. They see these TV shows, but I want to talk a little bit about Black nerd culture. And we'll start with you, Phil. Like, what would be your Blerd origin story? What was the show or comic or movie that you saw as a kid that made you say, yo, I'm into this. This is what I want to do. What started that for you?
Well, I'm old. And when I was young, there were no Blerds. If you were a nerd, that was a white thing. I mean, I remember, my mom's from Arkansas, and if I'd go back to the old place and hang with my old cousins, they'll be like, Phil, what the fuck you doing? Why are you just sitting there reading that dumb stuff? Come on, we going outside and play. Back then, you could either be Black or a nerd. But nowadays, there's Blerds.
You could sort of do both in a way that didn't even exist in the 80s. What about you, Jay? What was the moment where you were like, okay, I saw this thing, I saw this show, I saw this character, and I was like, that's me. That's my Blerd origin. What was that for you?
So I grew up in the 80s and 90s on the south side of Chicago. And I bring up that time because that's when gang violence was at its height and at its peak. And so my mother was extremely overprotective of myself and my younger brother, did not want us going out. So it was always watching cartoons consistently after school. Like, once you come home from school, you're in the house. Like, that was it. So I remember my WGN days watching G.I. Joe, then Transformers, then Jim, you know what I'm saying? Watching all of those things. I remember being the type of kid during the summer, couldn't leave my porch. So I was reading comic books on the porch because I couldn't go nowhere. And Phil is right. Like, back in the day, you were either Black or just the nerddom was for white people. It's crazy because even now, I have people I grew up with who were thugs, who were, in these streets, who would be like, man, bro, I used to see you on Collider. And I'd be like, what the fuck are you doing watching? You used to give me shit, but you watching me now on the stuff you used to make fun of me for.
Here's the thing. And it's funny because I think for myself, I'm an 80s, 90s kid. It was some of those cartoons. Although I remember, I'm sure Phil remembers this, I remember like Super Stretch and Micro Woman were like the first like black superheroes I remember seeing on like, it was like the Force 5. It was like that and Tarzan. It was those old Filmation cartoons from the 70s. And that became sort of part of my inspiration. We're heading into convention time. We've got San Diego Comic-Con. You've got, New York Comic-Con, all these different cons coming about. You guys are both going to be attending BlerdCon for the first time. What are you guys going to be doing there? I'll start with you, Jay, then we'll go to Phil. What are you going to do at BlerdCon? Are you just going to be talking? You're just going to be walking around? What are you going to do?
Everything that I can that's legal, because I want to be able to embrace all of this. Like, I've seen it on social media for years, and now to be a part of it in a sense is great. And I think the thing about BlerdCon for me is a lot of my friends are going to be there. You know what I'm saying? People I know. I'm talking with two of them right now. And so to have all the people there, and it's like to see all the people who may be fans of things that, I've never met, or people I may be a fan of that I haven't met. And then to see black cosplay, let me tell you something, that gives me no greater joy than to see black cosplay, because now it is just, you are that character. And I say that because back in the day, if it was a black dude wanted to be Thor, you were Black Thor. If it was a black dude that wanted to be somebody, you were Black whatever it is. Now you're just that character. And to watch the work and the intricacies and the details people put into it, I'd be like, yo, with the things you do with these cosplay costumes, can you just clean my apartment and organize it? Because I think you'll make it a whole lot better than I'll ever do it.
What about you, Phil? Because you're more of a con veteran. Like, you're going to be signing tables, you're going to be doing panels. What's your plan for BlerdCon this weekend?
Well, the best thing about coming to the cons is you get to talk to people about stuff you've done that they enjoyed. That's what cons about. It's about positive fandoms. Like, you come to something because you liked something. And, as a guest there, that's wonderful. I feel like at BlerdCon, it's going to be a more personal connection. Although these ain't shows I wrote. Most of them are just characters I did the voice of, which is at most a third of the character. But, like we said, Blerds do now exist. And people know who did voices of what. So that's a more personal connection. I mean, most of the time at a con, I'm just like saying thank you and congratulations to the fantastic creators I've been lucky enough to work with and work for. That's why I'm able to come to a con, because I've done a part in a show that was great.
One of the things that I have learned in my time hanging around you guys and sort of the larger group, whatever, is I've learned more about Hollywood in a couple years from like being around y'all through osmosis than years of Entertainment Weekly or whatever it is I see TV. And I've learned more about how careers work. We'll start with you, Phil. Like, I first remember you. Obviously, you had a career beforehand, but I remember seeing you on Mad TV, right? I remember you as the pool boy on Mad TV. I remember all the different stuff. You and Orlando Jones, who was at BlerdCon like a couple years ago. And then the next time, you're Samurai Jack, which is amazing because he doesn't even speak that much, but it's still this definitive voice. And then it's Hermes and all these other characters. So give us sort of a breakdown. How did you decide, hey, I'm gonna move less from this acting thing into voice work? Like, tell me a little bit about your career arc.
Well, weirdly, my first professional job, the thing that got me my union card in high school, was a cartoon. But back in the 80s, when I did the Mr. T cartoon, voice acting was not something that anybody said. Back then, when you did cartoons, that wasn't considered acting. So it wasn't until once I came into show business, really, after college and started pursuing things, I got lucky. Well, one, I started doing improv in college, and that took me to the Groundlings, and I was the first Black person to be voted into that theater company. That led me into sketch comedy, and that led me into Mad TV. And we were the first late night comedy show with more than one Black dude. And because it was based on Mad Magazine, they had us doing some little animated stuff. And I think that's what opened me up to the thing of, nowadays in the 90s, since cable blew up and Nickelodeon had 24 hours of children's programming, you could make a living doing voice stuff. That's why they say the term voice acting. But I also was able to connect it to performance. because, those of us doing sketches, we just did character. And then when we did the claymation pieces, we did more characters. But we didn't have to get in the costume and put on the damn wig. So I think that's probably what introduced me to the idea. It's like, well, maybe, dude, you know how to work on a mic. Maybe look down that road. And when I did, I got lucky as hell. Because the casting people who cast Mad TV were also casting the new show of the creator of The Simpsons. And that's a hell of a good place to start.
I want to flip it to you, Jay. You were a professional wrestler making a living with your body, and I met you as a stand-up. How did you make that transition?
So I've always cracked jokes. That was just natural for me. I was the kid that got in trouble for always cracking jokes. I used to get picked on so much because I got burned when I was 2. And so at one point I got tired of people talking about me. So I just started firing back. So I was able to do that. And I was able just to crack jokes and just tell funny stories naturally. While wrestling, I ended up messing up my neck a little bit. And so luckily it wasn't anything major. But at the time when that happened, this is when Facebook first opened up to the public after it was just, you had to have a college email. I would just write funny statuses at the time. And there was a girl who had a production company in Chicago who saw him. She was like, have you ever thought about doing stand-up? And I was like, not really. I mean, I wouldn't know how to get into it. And she was like, all right, let's have a meeting. So we had a meeting to set up for me doing my first open mic showcase. She was like, you just got to have 5 minutes. And I was like, 5 minutes worth of jokes? I can write that. That's easy. And I remember going to the Checkerboard Lounge in Hyde Park. It's no longer there. It was a historic spot in Chicago, did my first 5 minutes, and I killed. And I always tell everybody to this day, that was the worst thing that could have happened to me, was killing on my first time, because I got way too damn cocky. They was like, come back the next week. I was like, cool. I wrote another 5 minutes and I bombed like hell. And I was looking around like, no, y'all didn't get the memo from last week? And so then it started where, I was working a little bit more and learning the tricks of the trade with stand-up and being able to start doing shows in different places. So while that was happening, I was slowly pulling away from wrestling, but not fully yet. And I'll never forget, like, people would come to certain shows and they would see me on stage. They'd be like, wait, ain't you the dude that was just clotheslining somebody's head off? I'm like, hey, man, we don't want to talk about that right now. So this was the time when I knew it was time for a full transition from the businesses. I remember doing a show, so it was part of the match, and somebody in the crowd yelled out my wrestling name and said, hey, Trauma, why don't you go somewhere and tell a joke? And I yelled back, the joke is you survived the abortion. The crowd went crazy. After a while, more opportunities with stand-up started happening. And so I just decided to pull back from wrestling because it was like, oh, I can do 15, 20 minutes on stage and all I need is a Gatorade. I do 15, 20 minutes in the ring. I might need a day off, So now it became an easy transition, but now I also still get back in the ring every now and then out here in LA. Everybody's like, yo, you want to do it? I'm like, I'm bored. Let me go put on my wrestling boots. But things have been picking up again, so I'd leave my wrestling boots where they are. Like, they stay in the closet, in the tote, in the bottom, until they need to come out like the bat signal. And that's where those are.
We're going to take a short break, and we come back more on BlerdCon and Blerd culture. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned. The next generation of influential Black voices can be found on NPR's new collection, Black Stories, Black Truth. Black Stories, Black Truth is a celebration of Blackness from NPR. Each of NPR's Black voices are as distinct, varied, and nuanced as the Black experience itself. In the Black Stories, Black Truths collection, you'll hear stories of joy, resilience, empowerment, and creating world-shifting things out of struggle. Every episode is a living account about what it means to be Black today, told from a unique Black perspective. From Bobby Shmurda to The Wire, Michelle Obama to reparations, there's no limit to the range of Black Stories, Black Truths. Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now they are the story. Hear a feed of episodes from across NPR's podcasts that center Black voices. It's NPR Noir. Turn on NPR today and hear a range of voices as varied, nuanced, and Black as the country they reflect. Listen now to Black Stories, Black Truths from NPR wherever you get podcasts.
There was a time when summer surprised us, when galleries opened minds, adventures opened hearts, and we all remained open to whatever the day might offer. It was a time to enjoy. It was summer, this summer, at Biltmore. Plan your visit or overnight stay so you can enjoy the marvelous works of Chihuly and savor the season. Reserve now at Biltmore.com.
This is Jason Johnson, host of A Word, Slate's podcast about race and politics and everything else. I want to take a moment to welcome our new listeners. If you've discovered A Word and like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts. And let us know what you think by writing us at aword@slate.com. Thank you. You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today, we're talking about this year's BlerdCon and Blerd culture with comedian Jay Washington and actor Phil Lamarr. I got to ask you guys both this. This is something that's been going around a lot. It's hugely viral. It's something that was shared sort of in our community, our Discord, and our chat. There is a clip of LeVar Burton having a conversation with Lawrence Fishburne, who's playing the head coach of the Clippers in a series called Clip, which was all about the Donald Sterling scandal, et cetera, et cetera.
You know the chains I wore in Roots? I keep them over the hearth in my living room, right above my 12 Emmys. What is that about?
I don't know. What is it to you?
America first met me as Kunta Kinte, a young African kid who was kidnapped, tortured, refused his slave name. Then I read to their children and maintained the integrity of their favorite spaceship. Pretty soon, people began to think of me as safe.
Oh, the safest.
Once, I read Go the Fuck to Sleep for charity.
Yeah.
One of my brand partners dropped me.
What, you can't even say fuck?
I can, but there are consequences. I said fuck. I lost money.
Shit.
If I showed how angry I really am, but I'm not gonna hide it. So I keep my chains on the wall in the living room. I want my guests to know, while I am unquestionably their friend, I am also absolutely filled with rage.
That was an amazing moment. It was an amazing bit of acting. It was an amazing monologue. And LeVar comes to our brunches from time to time. We refer to him as the Blerd father. I've joked with people that when I first met LeVar Burton, when the man hugs you, I mean, he smells like jasmine and hope. Like he looks at you the way you wish your dad always did. Like it's just that kind of energy. So what did you think of what he said in that segment? We just played it for the audience. How did that strike you as someone who's been in the industry as long as you have? Did it surprise you to hear that from LeVar? What was just sort of your reaction to that moment of the Blerd father talking about the challenges of remaining authentic to his blackness in a business that's about fantasy?
Well, it didn't surprise me that he had stuff from Roots. I mean, that was his first big blow up. And it's the first thing I always remember him from. And it was so huge throughout the world. But the personal level is what I'm like, oh, wow, dude, you don't think of it as just a prop? Nope. He thinks about much more.
Do you think that comes from not just his experiences, but is that something, do you think the industry tries to beat that out of you? Like, because there's some people who have been as successful as LeVar, maybe not in that area, where they're afraid to say something like that. They would be afraid. You know, it's interesting because in the monologue, he says, look, I made a statement once and I lost a sponsor. Do you think the industry sometimes tries to force that out of Black creatives?
I hate to say it this way. Look at Will Smith. We had this one, the industry especially had this one particular way they saw Will Smith. He was safe for all intents and purposes until the Oscar situation. Now we all can feel how we feel about it, and various people feel a certain way, but it took one moment for everybody to flip and be like, huh? What? You're not the safe Black dude we thought you were? You're not the normal Fresh Prince who just happens to be Mike Lowry every time? Oh, you can actually snap out and be angry. Because it was this conceived notion of who he is. So when LeVar said all that, I was like, I get it. And he says how you don't know how frustrated I am down inside, because that's something a lot of us as Black men hold deep every day. We go through so many trials and tribulations. A lot of people forget about that.
Does how you perform change when you're performing in front of a Black audience as opposed to a mixed audience or white audience? And does it change with the types of Black audiences that you perform in front of? Or do you say, hey, look, this is Jay Washington, regardless, I may only tailor it at the corners, but I'm going to be the same dude no matter who I'm talking to?
I think you just you tailor it a little bit, right? You give them a little bit of a something of a little bit of difference just to know, hey, I can connect with you, but this is still who I am. You know, like I can be that person, but I'm going to be me regardless. I think it's just knowing that you first off got to be confident in who you are as a performer. That's the number one thing. Like, listen, you're going to like me. If you like me, if you don't, you don't. I will say this one thing. There is not a single comedian on God's green earth who everyone is a fan with. And I'm fine with that.
Phil, I want to ask you the same thing, more con specific, right? You are a voice actor, a voice that all of us have heard since we were kids throughout our lives, tons of different cartoons, tons of different things. And I'm sure that a lot of times people just want to come up to you and say, do the thing, right? Do that voice, et cetera, et cetera. Do different races of fans treat you differently? Or is it pretty universal because, you know, you've played so many different characters, so many different races, so many different places?
It is pretty much the same because of cons. The people who bother to come to these things are doing it for the same reason, not just for where they're from, what they watched, or whatever. But also, I've been lucky enough to have a pretty wide series of things that people respond to. But it's not always crossover. I mean, there's Static Shock fans that ain't never watched Futurama, you know? I mean, not everybody watches everything. Although it's interesting because, you know, I'll have people come up talking about Static, and it's not just Black folks, you know? There will be people of multiple colors coming up like, I love that show. It was so real. And it's funny because nobody's saying the word diversity, but you can tell that, you know, it's like, oh, wow, when this white guy was a kid, seeing a Black hero set something new in his head, and he realizes it now that he's an adult.
We're going to take a short break. When we come back, more about Black nerd culture and BlerdCon. This is A Word with Jason Johnson. Stay tuned.
Whatever you think about the presidential campaign circus, one thing is guaranteed. The U.S. Supreme Court is going to be absolutely central to what happens in the coming election, and they've just released a raft of decisions that reach into just about every aspect of your life, from pollution to air travel, abortion rights, gun violence, and of course, presidential immunity. I'm Dahlia Lithwick, and we just wrapped up our Opinion Palooza series on Amicus, Slate's podcast about the courts and the law, where we break down the weedy details of Supreme Court news to make it accessible to real, smart, non-lawyer people like you. It has been a truly mind-boggling 7 weeks of news from the High Court, and we want to make sure that you understand it all. All of the episodes in this series are now available, and if you become a Slate Plus subscriber, you'll get access to a whole bunch of bonus episodes too, like The Court of King Alito, where we examine how this justice's fondness for flag-waving intersects with how he does his day job. Listen to Opinion Palooza on Amicus Now. That's AMICUS, wherever you're listening now.
You're listening to A Word with Jason Johnson. Today we're talking about Black nerd culture with comedian Jay Washington and actor Phil Lamarr. So Black nerd culture, we're at this sort of interesting crossroads. On the one hand, there are more opportunities to do creative work in science fiction, fantasy spaces than there's ever been before. The world has opened in a lot of ways, but there also seems to be this cottage industry now of anti-woke YouTubers and anti-woke Instagrammers whose whole business is about tearing down anything that is superhero or fantasy oriented that's not just white. You know, I'll start with Jay and then I'll move to you, Phil. Jay, do you think that the internet has made being in these creative spaces harder now because there's such a cottage industry in attacking Black creatives? Or do you think it's sort of just been a net positive? You're always going to have people to hate, but I can get my work out now. I can I can do my 5, I can do a whole comedy routine on Star Wars now and get different people to see me than perhaps was the case before.
I think you said it in the word, you said your breakdown of it, business. It becomes a business. It's a money thing now. It's a grift. Now, don't get me wrong. There are people who feel like this and have always felt like this. I do agree it's difficult for creatives to tell stories, because if that story isn't what this white dude who lives in his mom's basement didn't know when he was 10, now he's complaining, not realizing the story isn't meant for him anymore. It's for a new generation. People forget that these stories evolve. The characters have always evolved. So why is it when the character evolves from being a fictional alien who's white to a fictional alien who's black, it's a problem? I just don't get that.
I know what you're talking about, this, people attacking stuff. I think that has to do with the internet and the polarization of our culture these days. Anything that's out there, there's always somebody who's going to be pushing against whatever it is. Because on the internet, you get attention. And in today's world, attention is, its own kind of money. And whatever is getting people's support, you can attack it and you'll get some attention. But I don't know that it's making it more difficult for creators. To me, coming back from the old days, it was more difficult back then because there was less diversity in the minds of decision makers than there is now. Now these people are pushing back because companies are pushing for diversity, but there is also companies pushing against stuff. But from the creative standpoint, we have way more opportunity and accessibility than we had back in the old days. I remember hearing stories about, well, sorry, Phil, your character you guessed in on the sitcom, we can't give him a girlfriend because if there's 2 black people in the scene, when people are clicking by, they might think that's a black show, and then they'll just click on past. That was the mentality back then. Nowadays, you put on a show like Friends, and people look at you funny. When Friends was a big hit, nobody said anything about, why don't they have any non-white friends or even people that they see? Nowadays, audiences and executives will think about that. So that's the progress. But you're right. The internet progress is also a negative progress in that it has given people more motivation to attack shit. That's good.
Phil, I want to ask you this, and I'll go to Jay too. I have a student. He's done video games. He's an aspiring voice actor. You have this unique path because you said you started acting and then you were in a show that was a mixed media show. And then you got on, Futurama, which was an American classic that's been like brought back 3 different times now, which is not a lot of shows have had that kind of longevity. If you're talking to a 22-year-old now with the resources that are available, with everything from I can do my voice work on TikTok to I can also worry that my voice will be stolen by AI. What would you advise someone who's getting into the industry now, who may be looking at you as a guide? What would you tell them to do or how to do things coming in 2024?
It's tough because most of the time somebody asks me, how do I get started in the industry? I'm like, well, dude, if you want to listen to my advice, the first thing you got to do is get a time machine because I only know how to get started 30 years ago. Because the industry has changed. And what I tell people is just about the stuff that is the same, the status of the work. It's called voice acting, but that's a misnomer because the acting comes before the voice. That's what's more important, is playing the character. Something that was true back in the day, I don't know if diversity has changed this, but those of us in minorities had a wider range than people in the majority. Because when you are, a minority, you know your culture, but you also definitely know the majority culture because it's all around you. And I remember, when I started voiceover back in the old days, most of the characters were not characters of color, but for a person of color, that's how you got brought in, is if they had some little character with 2 lines or a crow that they think they want to sound black. then they'd bring you in. But, when they hire you, they need you to do 3 voices. So a person of color getting brought into a recording studio needed to be able to do more than just the one voice they grew up hearing.
Jay, I have a similar sort of question for you. If you were talking to somebody today and they were like, hey, I have a viral TikTok where I did a funny skit or I went on stage, what would you tell them is a good entry route? What would you tell them are the skills to do? Because you still tour. And in my brain, being able to go out and work a crowd is still a skill set that is as, if not more valuable than being able to do a good skit on TikTok.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think the problem is when you come to the industry and the gatekeepers of this business, right? Because now for them, it's all about the dollar signs. The art, quote unquote, part of it isn't a big thing. For anybody who wants to get into it, I've had so many people ask me, well, how do I start? And I'm always like, find an open mic. Find an open mic. Because that's the easiest thing. Like, if you want to tell me, all right, I went viral for this. All right, cool. But is your going viral getting you real followers who will become real fans who will in terms pay money to come see you in person? Now, for some people, that has actually happened. I cannot deny that. It is a real thing that happens. But when you're talking about stand-up comedy and people think you're going to tell jokes and you don't have no jokes, you're in for a rude awakening. I've seen this happen. There have been TikTokers who have been brought through the clubs out here in Los Angeles and they filled out the room because they have this massive following, right? And everybody's like, oh my God, they're going to be hilarious for an hour. And all of a sudden they're just like, hey, what y'all think about airplanes? Like, they don't have jokes because they haven't built up that muscle. And that's what it is actually to be on stage, is a muscle you work out. So at the end of the day, you can have fun. You can have fun and be viral and do all these things on social media because now that's what you seem to have to do. But when it comes to that stage, it's like the stage don't lie. When you're behind that microphone, you got to be actually funny in that moment. Now, if you got fans who don't care and are just going to keep paying to see you regardless, unfortunately, that is a thing too.
What's the next thing you got coming up? How can somebody follow you? Where's your next show? What's your next TV thing? What's your independent project? We'll start with you, Phil. Somebody who's like, oh my God, I love Phil Lamarr. I haven't thought about him for a while. I'll go see him at BlerdCon. But what do you have coming up? What do you have that you want people to know is sort of next on your plate in the Phil Lamarr world?
Well, later this month, a new season of Futurama is dropping. And, well, it's funny because we do a improv comedy show called The Black Version every month in LA, but we also tour. We've done the Kennedy Center a couple of times, played in New York, but now I've been talking with some of my friends from the group. We're thinking we should start bringing the Black Version to cons.
And Jay, what have you got coming up next? How can people follow you? How can people know the next thing that's coming down the pipe for you in your career?
Man, I tell everybody, follow my social media, Instagram, TikTok, Mr. J Washington, MRJAY. You should know how to spell Washington. I have a wrestling podcast, Before the Bell podcast. The link is there. August 23rd and 24th, I will be headlining the Comedy Catch Comedy Club in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'll be coming out to Vegas in October for the Laugh After Dark Fest. On the 15th of this month, which is a Monday, I'll be in Pasadena at the Ice House taping a set for OnlyFans. OnlyFans has a comedy thing for OnlyFans TV, and so we're taping comedy sets for that.
Actor Phil Lamarr and comedian Jay Washington will both be at BlerdCon. Make sure you see them. Thank you so much for joining me on A Word today.
Thank you for sharing a word with us.
Thank you for having us, my brother.
And that's A Word for this week. The show's email is aword@slate.com. This episode was produced by Kristie Taiwo-Makanjuola. Alicia Montgomery is the vice president of audio at Slate. Our theme music was produced by Don Will. I'm Jason Johnson. Tune in next week for A Word.